Hi, everybody. We're so excited for this panel today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is a topic that's obviously near and dear to my heart, and in celebration of AAPI Heritage Month, we put together an incredible panel today to share their experiences on the AAPI experience in financial services. So first, thank you to my fellow panelists. I am really looking forward to our discussion today. And for all of our guests, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We're going to be going through our discussion and then hopefully leave plenty of time to tackle questions at the end. So I am joined by friends, clients, colleagues for this session today. I'm excited to welcome Shindy Chen, CEO of Scribe, Gordon Lau, founder and managing director of Promise Holdings and the co-founder of AIM, and Sam Wang, managing director and global head of corporate comms for MSCI. But I'm actually going to start off by having everybody give a quick introduction on both themselves and their companies before we launch into our conversation today. So let's start with Shindy, then Gordon, then Sam.
I'm Shindy Chen. I'm the founder and CEO of Scribe. We are a financial content agency, and our clients are typically everyone from late-stage fintech startups all the way to some of the world's biggest financial brands. We've been around for about 5.5 years, and we specialize in either copy or short and long form blog content and white papers and ebooks. So financial copy and content is our expertise, and we look forward to helping any of you guys out there with any of your content marketing questions.
Great. Thank you, Bina. Thanks to everybody. Thanks, Sam and Shindy. Really happy to be here. I'm Gordon Lau, based in Chicago, from the south side of Chicago. So I have a lot to talk about here, but I'll just be quick. My firm is called Promise Holdings. We're a holding company that does private equity and venture capital investments on a deal-by-deal basis. We have ownership interests in about 16 companies. I'm happy and proud to say that over half of them are run by a woman or a person of color. And that's a mandate of mine. And it's really kind of what I focus on in my career, which is make a lot of money, but also do well for our communities. So I call it activism by capitalism. Yeah, let me just leave it at that, and we'll start the conversation in a minute.
Hi, everyone. Sam, and it's an honor to be on this very distinguished panel and distinguished host in Bina as well. I am the interim chief marketing officer and global head of corporate communications for MSCI. We are a major investment tools and research firm in the investment industry, probably most known historically for our index production, our emerging markets index, market classification, but I think more recently around topics involving ESG, of which this discussion is very pertinent, from that perspective. So look forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, Sam. And thank you again to all of our panelists for making the time to do this. So the reason why we wanted to hold this event is, and we were just chatting about this in our prep session, but there's been so much discussion around the AAPI experience, and I think sadly the recent events with the uptick in anti-Asian violence and crimes has thrown a spotlight on, I think, a lot of the issues that all of us have known and been familiar with, but certainly has thrust straight into the spotlight, which is important. And how do we turn that moment into a movement? And in reflection, we wanted to start off by talking a little bit about, how has being a member of the AAPI community impacted or shaped your professional career, and why? So I'm actually going to throw that right over to Shindy to begin with, to share her experience.
Yeah, it's really funny. It has a lot to do with where I am today. I feel like where I am is the sum of my experience. I think all of us at one point or time, by our families, we were encouraged to go this biomedical route because it usually guaranteed prestige, or at least that's what our families believed. And so when I started college, I definitely started down that track. But I think midway through, I had this feeling like I hate biology. I hate the sight of blood. I'm not going to do this. So I remember I had to go study abroad in London to muster up the courage to tell my parents that I was going to be an English major and pursue that. And so I was in English and journalism, but even when I graduated, that wasn't the first field I pursued. I somehow landed in a financial services career and worked in that career trajectory for a better part of 7 years. And then after that, I went back into my first passion of English and journalism, and that's when I pursued broadcast journalism. So by then, I already had that experience in financial services, mixed the two, and here I am several years later, specializing in financial content for our clients after having had published a book about finance and working in several content management roles that specifically deal with finance and financial services. So it's been an interesting course, and it definitely isn't what I was encouraged to do growing up.
Sam, you wanna go next?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think my story is probably not too dissimilar than Shindy's or Gordon's or many of you who were on this webinar. I actually grew up as the son of an electrical engineering professor. So I think the expectations were very similar to what Shindy mentioned, which were like, you're going to do really well in math, you're going to do well in sciences, and just continue on that trajectory. And I also so happened to grow up in North Carolina at a time when there were not too many Asian people in North Carolina. It's a lot different today, but back in the dark ages when I was there, it was a lot different. And so, you know, I started my collegiate career studying engineering, and I did fine. I was doing well grade-wise, but it really wasn't my passion. And it was very difficult for me to tell my father, who was a very distinguished double E professor at a prestigious university, to basically tell him, I don't think I'm really going to be following in your footsteps. But and you know, he was totally cool with it and very supportive. I ended up graduating with a degree in economics and political science. So I tried to kind of stay true to some of the roots around you know, math skills and that sort of thing. But then I found myself, my first job out of college was actually on Capitol Hill. So I was a legislative aide, which I don't think my parents or anyone in my family could have actually foreseen. And so then I decided, you know, maybe I want to become a lawyer. Then I got admitted to law school, and then I tore the letter up and said, this is actually not for me either. So I changed course once again and decided to go to business school. And that led me down this marketing and communications path. So, you know, I think a lot of this is around, you kind of have to find yourself within kind of the broader expectations that people may have for you. And not such an easy thing. I mean, I'm still to this day, you know, I kind of pinch myself sometimes and say, I actually cannot believe I'm in marketing and communications. I feel like I just kind of fell into this over time, but I'm actually pretty good at it and pretty instinctive about it. And it's, you know, and I know we're going to kind of explore this, but I often wonder, now that I'm, you know, kind of continuing on this path, to what degree is it that my ethnicity and how I was raised and kind of the environmental dynamics around me, what role have they actually played in all of this as I've continued on this journey?
Yeah, I definitely relate. I mean, I think we probably have similar experiences. In some ways, it's the ethnicity, but also the cultural expectations about, you know, what do your parents, especially, you know, I'm the daughter of, you know, immigrants from Korea. There's a certain expectation. We sacrificed everything. We moved here, and you're going to be an English major, which I think shapes, you know, how we think about our careers and what choices we make. But Gordon, I don't know if you've had a similar experience as well.
Yeah, maybe I'll take a slightly different take. I think I have similar, but also very different experience. Although I will say I also started college as an English major, which is really odd here. It's crazy. But I grew up in the far south side of Chicago. I was the only Asian kid in a predominantly Black community in a Black high school. So activism and civil rights was always actually very forefront in kind of my world. And I was fortunate. I was a boy that actually played sports. And I always tell people this really shaped me because I played basketball, which was literally 12 Black guys, one white guy, and me. And I played baseball, which was literally 12 white guys, one Black guy, and me. And I learned how to navigate both locker rooms. I learned how to code switch. And that was super, super helpful for me in my career after college, because it was just, I learned how to be myself. And I learned also to, I hate the word, but to integrate and to figure out America, right? Because at that time, Asian Americans weren't a fabric of America, really. We either had to adhere to and assimilate, I hate that word, but we had to assimilate into either the Caucasian kind of culture or the Black culture. And that was really what was expected in US society. So I kind of discovered my Asianness in undergrad. I went to the University of Illinois. It was a very large Asian population. We had a lot of social activism for Asian American studies programs and Asian American Cultural Center programs. And I realized there that it was really great to be different. I embraced my Asianness in college. And I realized about a couple years after I graduated from college that I wanted to work my identity into what I do every day. And I think that wasn't accepted probably 20, 30 years ago. And I think what I'm really proud of and what I'm hopeful for with this moment that's happening is that all of us, hopefully, on this call, the four of us, plus, many others in this webinar, we can more openly embrace our culture into our professional lives. And that's probably how I would try to answer that question, which is like about how being Asian American has shaped my professional career, which is I'm really proud of it now. And I want to make sure that it always permeates throughout everything that I do professionally.
I think that's such a great lead in to our next question. And Gordon, I'm actually going to have you pick this one up. But talking about, we've talked a lot about our youth and our upbringing, but we all ended up in financial services, right? Whether intentional or not, we all work now in the financial services industry. And I'm curious, did you ever run into biases, pushback, stereotypes in your careers in financial services? And how did you deal with it or overcome it? So Gordon, I'm actually going to have you take this one first.
Yeah, so let me answer it a little bit differently. I'm sorry, let me answer it in different ways. So one, personally, I have, of course, I would guess that almost all of us have, whether it's subtle or not, throughout our career. And I'll answer it a little differently also this way, which is when I was my second year in business school, I actually was able to get Harvard to pay for me to fly around the country. And I interviewed 40 different Asian American executives. And I wrote a paper on the Asian American glass ceiling, or as my friend Jane here, the author, writes, the breaking the bamboo ceiling. And what we found in our paper answers your question directly, which is, what do a lot of Asian Americans face in corporate America? They face a lot of stereotypes. In terms of, well, first of all, the paper was about, we talked about that there is statistically underrepresentation at the C-suites for Asian Americans. It's just statistically proven. And the reasons why was really what our paper was about. The first reason why we called it cultural legacy Asian values, meaning, especially within East Asian America, there's a lot of things that our parents taught us or in our culture, right? Like deference to elders, don't complain, put your head down, and you do a great job and work your ass off, and like they will promote you, this meritocracy, belief in meritocracy, which is complete BS in corporate America. And then to the question about stereotypes, right? That's the second thing that we wrote our paper about was, there are stereotypes from senior management oftentimes. And what are they? Asian Americans are always quant jocks, right? They're really good at math and IT and engineering. They're not really the prototypical leader. They're not 6'2", blonde hair, blue-eyed college football quarterback. Their communication skills are lacking. They're not really like great for general management roles. They want to stay in the technical roles. And so that's kind of how I would answer the question. And then you bring it back to me personally. I faced all of that, right? Like you walk into a room and you never have to actually like, for us, like there's always a stereotype that, oh, can you help me with the laptop? Oh, you're really good at IT, aren't you? Can you fix this for me? And also, people not necessarily looking to you to be the leader in the room, the alpha male in the room. And I'm not saying being an alpha male is always good, but let's face it, in the financial industry, like people are alpha males, right? Those are the guys that get the most attention, or women that get the most attention. And so I've tried to, throughout my career from a young age, be different, be outspoken. You guys can kind of sense my style here. Like I'm not afraid to like just be myself and be somewhat aggressive, and just kind of command the room, because I want to defy all the stereotypes of typical Asian American males in our society.
Sam, I would be curious about, if you faced similar stereotypes and expectations as also as an Asian American male in the financial services field.
I think I think it's probably been a little bit more on the subtle side as opposed to the overt side, but I've kind of felt this throughout my career. Oddly enough, I personally didn't feel it as much when I worked on Capitol Hill for 5 years, even though I was one of the few Asians at the time who was in a legislative kind of capacity, but I did start to feel it a little bit more in the corporate world. And I think even I remember specific examples of where I had bosses who would kind of behind closed doors say to one of my bosses, "Oh, I think I finally reached Sam because he's a different kind of person." And I thought, wow, this is not cool. And how do I kind of work against that? But I want to kind of pick up on something that Gordon just mentioned, because this gets a little bit into more kind of the mindset and the personality, so to speak. But I think one thing that I just kind of noticed as I was growing up was, and this is obviously, everything is always kind of specific to your own family, to your kind of parents' experiences, but my father was the type of person who always said, the hard work is going to speak for itself. And I think that is definitely true, and I've followed that lead for sure. What I do find in corporate America, though, is sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes it's not just the hard work. You do have to kind of be a little bit of a louder voice. You have to kind of portray yourself a little bit differently. And this is probably like too much information, but I think particularly when I was in the early stages of my career, I was a little gun shy on those sorts of things. And I think it helped me back a little bit at certain times. I wouldn't kind of speak up for what I believed in, or when it was time for a promotion. I thought that my father was right. The hard work is going to speak for itself. And then I would see somebody else get promoted and I didn't. And then, so it's a little bit more subtle for me. I never felt like there were overt forms of that I was being passed over because somebody looked, like a certain thing that they were looking for. It was just more, wow, do I actually need to be a little bit more vocal here? And, I'm not afraid to say this, to some degree, I feel like when I turn on my laptop, when I show up at the office, I have to do a little bit of acting at times, because this is a little bit, out of my own kind of personal, how I carry myself, which is, I don't want to call it more modest, but a little bit more kind of straightforward and humble. So, so for whatever that's worth, I think these are real issues, though, because when you're trying to build your career and kind of advance yourself and, and take care of your families, these things become, they become real issues.
Absolutely. I know we've talked about sort of the expectations or maybe the stereotypes around Asian American men. Certainly there are many that exist around Asian American women, which I've, been pretty vocal about, especially, coming up in my career. I think things that people would say to me as an Asian American woman, and even at like cocktail parties, is certainly something that I encountered entering into the corporate world versus, even in university. But Shindy, I'd be curious about, your experiences within financial services.
Yeah, it's so interesting hearing both Gordon and Sam's backgrounds and just seeing the parallels because when I was young, my father was also a computer science professor, but he eventually became quite entrepreneurial and opened a Chinese restaurant on the North Carolina and South Carolina border. And I was working there from a very young age. And just those stereotypes, it's like people walk in and you speak to them and they immediately look at you and they're surprised. They're like, oh my God, you speak English so well, or you don't have an accent. And that to me at the time as a young girl, you process that and you're not sure what to say. But then those are like those micro, I guess, stereotypes that Gordon had mentioned, perceived or not, we definitely experienced it. So in financial services, one experience I had, and I didn't think much of it at the time, but I was working in lending. And so we serviced a neighborhood, like a new subdivision that was being built in North Atlanta, which was a community primarily of Korean. It was a primarily Korean community. And so all of the clients were Korean. And I'm Chinese. And for some reason, our capture ratios there were very low. So they decided to install me as like a representative of the lending company, I guess just because of my physical likeness, despite the fact that I didn't speak any Korean. And I definitely made attempts to learn and became quite conversational. But it's just kind of those little biases. It's like, oh, she looks like them, so she might be able to help our business there. So those are, it's very interesting. Now I look back and think that was just so silly. But I don't know that I improved their capture ratios that much better, but it was nice at least to work in that community. And I made a lot of really great friends and met a lot of wonderful people. So that was probably the only time that I really faced that head on. But yes, in terms of going back to what Sam said, I know I'm an introvert. I've taken that test before and I know I'm an INTJ. I think I was one of only 2 people who were introverts in a business school class. Everybody else was an extrovert. So I do agree with Sam in that sometimes when you are in that corporate setting, you do have to pretend you're on a stage. It's kind of like that Susan Cain book, Quiet, where she teaches people to just pretend or act in that scenario so that you feel confident enough to speak out and raise your voice, because otherwise, you are exactly right. The hard work isn't enough. You've got to actually speak up and throw your hat in the ring, make yourself present and known in order to have success in the boardroom as well. And then obviously your hard work speaks for itself.
Yeah, I think this is a great, tie into this next, conversation point, which is really important. And, being told countless times, you need to speak up, and how that impacts, when you're earlier on in your career, your progression into the executive suite or the boardroom. And I think we all have chatted about AAPI representation in the boardroom. I think there have been various research studies, I think even one that AIM did, about lack of representation once you get up to either founding levels, executive level, C-suite. And I'd be curious, why do you think that is? Why is it that, there might be stronger representation from the AAPI community at junior level, so once we reach, the C-suite, it's dropping off at such a fast clip? So Gordon, I'm going to have you take this one.
Yeah, so at AIM, which for those in the webinar stands for the Association of Asian American Investment Managers, 6 of us started in 2006. We're focused on really making sure that fund managers who happen to be Asian American, who want to raise funds, understand and know that there's actually there's billions of dollars out there allocated towards emerging managers, which are focused on women and minority managers. And our community didn't know about it very much until we started AIM in 2006. We've done a lot of studies about this. And in fact, we've recently commissioned 2 studies. One that's focused on how many Asian American owned firms are out there across all asset classes, meaning private equity, venture capital, hedge, real estate, asset management. And the numbers are dismal. I mean, it's very, very small numbers. I mean, there's a little bit higher, for example, in venture capital and hedge. When you get into private equity and real estate and asset management, it's like less than like 3%. or something like that. And the performance of those firms are really, really good though. And then the second study we've actually commissioned is a survey on why there is the question that you asked, Bina, which is we're actually overrepresented as a community in the junior ranks. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? But given that, you know, we are overrepresented in the really, really top colleges as well, why is it that we're so underrepresented when you get to the senior ranks? And I think it's really like a lot of answers. I think it's both internal to our community a little bit, but it's also external to the community. And so internal is kind of like what I talked about and what we wrote about in the paper that I wrote, which is we do have this lack of wanting to promote ourselves, which Shindy and Sam also talked about. You know, again, we just believe we work our ass off, work 18 hours as an analyst, build that model, you know, don't complain. They're going to say, oh yeah, let's promote him. And everybody knows, you know, I did 2 years of investment banking. I'm in private equity now. Like when you get to the senior ranks, you're not building models. You're not stuck in your computer. You're out there like selling, or you're like, you have human interaction. You need to like learn new skills about how to relate to people, how to get people to trust you, right? Like I've had to get people in like Texas, 3 hours south of any major city, to like who probably has never really had a friend that looks like me, to look like to get them to trust me. And that takes like a human skill. It's a soft skill. And so that's one thing I'll highlight just when I say internal to our community that we need to work on to kind of get more representation. And then externally, it's kind of, again, similar to what I was saying, like as Asian Americans, we're just not often looked at as leaders. And again, like people hire like people, or they promote people that are like themselves. And so when in the financial services industry, when a lot of the senior leaders are Caucasian males, you know, and this is terrible stereotypes, but I'm just saying, like, I'll just use an example. Like, you know, a lot of times they will promote people that are similar to them, like that grew up, went to the same prep school in the Northeast, or belong to the same country club, or, you know, they can talk sports with all the time, and you know, all these different things. And a lot of Asian Americans just don't have the same network, or didn't grow up the same way, or don't have the same interests. And so I think all of that really adds into kind of the question that you asked, Ben. And I'll just leave with one last thing, which is I really feel this is very important to me. We need to change this narrative about the model minority myth that we have, because everybody's like, oh, you guys are doing great. Like, look, you guys are all these Ivy League schools. Why are you complaining? And the narrative that I think we need to change to is the NBA, which almost everybody knows about, right? 75% of the players in the NBA are African American. Less than 10% are coaches, general managers, or owners. And the entire country knows this, and they're okay with it. They say that is a problem. When I say okay, I mean that they recognize that it's a problem. Nobody's telling the NBA players to stop complaining. We have the exact same issue in corporate America. Like, we're like 50% of like some engineering firms or IT firms in Silicon Valley, and less than 5% of the C-suite. But people tell us to stop complaining, and we're not really a minority. Like, that narrative needs to change, in my opinion. So I'll stop. I've talked a lot. I apologize.
No, that's really helpful. And I think, you know, I think that analogy that you used about the MBA is so apt. And Gordon, I mean, not Gordon, I'm sorry, Sam, I think you were sharing that you have some data too, but would be curious about what you or even MSCI is seeing in terms of, from an ESG perspective, representation.
For sure. Yeah. So I took the liberty. We have a very prolific ESG research department at MSCI. So I tapped on a couple of our leaders just to pull some data points, because I think all of us, since we're in financial services, data is king, right? So data and queen, and drives kind of the decision making, drives the story. But so here are a few data points just to consider. And these are actually from a 2020 report from KPMG. So pretty relevant. The US Asian population between 2000 and 2015 grew 72%. At the end of 2018, Asian Americans made up 12% of the US professional workforce, despite making up only 6.1% of the overall population. Yet, nearly 72% of Fortune 100 companies do not have a single Asian director on their boards. And among those that do, only 6% have more than one such individual. So, you think about what Gordon was saying, and I think he's exactly right, because when you get to a certain point in management, it is much less about the skill set and much more about the soft skills. And I see that every single day. I mean, I recruit senior level people to our organization, and I don't have a single conversation about whether or not somebody can write a marketing brochure. It's all about, like, how have you actually driven the strategy? How have you influenced others? And whether this is right or wrong, I think that is part of the ongoing myth or stereotype that we have to continue to break through as a group. I will also say something else, which is I've been very fortunate that the last two companies I have worked at, which are MSCI currently, and my company before, which was Synchrony Financial, were both run by people of diversity. So Synchrony Financial, up until recently, was run by a woman who came from working class family in Queens. She got it right from the get-go. And when I helped spin that company out of General Electric, that was one of her initial points of emphasis was, I'm a woman leader. I think at the time she was one of maybe 5 women CEOs in financial services in the country. And she said, I've got to own this. And I've got to have a lot of diversity amongst my management team. So that was great. And I was fortunate to be a part of that, kind of shift. And MSCI, we are run by a Latin American native who has gone through and continues to go through many of the same things that we are talking about. In fact, that was one of the reasons why, I ended up at MSCI, was because I had long, extensive conversations with him about coming from immigrant families. And, to some degree, it doesn't matter where you come from in the world, you all kind of experience very similar things. So he gets it. And I think, he's done an extraordinary job just kind of making sure that these things are front and center every single day when we are running our business, when we're looking for clients. This whole notion of leveling the playing field is extremely critical at our company.
Thank you, Sam. I'm going to move us on to talking about change. I think we've shared a lot about our experiences and some of the stereotypes, the biases we face that are probably continue to hold people back within the industry. And, sadly, the recent uptick in anti-Asian violence, or even maybe just the recognition of anti-Asian violence as a hate crime, has created more awareness of the issues that face the AAPI community. And a lot of the questions that I've certainly been getting from clients, from friends in the industry, is what's changing? How can we help change what is changing? And I would love to know from each of you, whether through industry contacts or just your observations, do you feel that changes are happening within the financial services community, whether in light of increased public awareness or just generally rise in discussion around DE&I within the industry? So Shindy, I'll start off with you. I'd be curious to hear if you've noticed any change.
I think I have just noticed more awareness, which is wonderful. I think as far as diversity and inclusion, it starts from the top, obviously. So I've been reading and preparing for this, and I've seen some companies that are just very resourceful, right? They're serving as resources to help any of their Asian employees and just listening. And that is a great step forward. and things that you're doing as well, Bina, in the public space, where you're just bringing attention to these acts of violence, but also letting people know what you guys are doing about it. And I just think making a conscientious effort to place Asians in positions of leadership is a great step forward. And so, you know, whereas before, maybe certain people weren't considered for leadership roles or even executive type roles, but now when I'm hopeful that when you have human resources or even people at the executive level who are installing new people for these types of positions, that they'll consider and broaden the net for who will be considered male or female. But just, you know, diversity, I think, is just, it's not going to hurt anybody. To have a more well-rounded and compassionate and human touch of a true representation of the US and specific areas of the US. I think it's just, all of that is a great step forward.
Thank you. Gordon, I'd love to hear your point of view. And of course, you're sitting in DC right now, and I know you're you're involved in a lot of change related conversations, and I would be curious to hear what you're experiencing or hearing from the FS industry.
Yeah, so as Bina said, I'm in DC here. I didn't get dressed up for you guys, I'm sorry. But I'm in DC at a conference with a political advocacy organization called Leaders Forum, and we're focused on Asian American political advocacy. And we've met with a lot of leaders here in the government on DEI. So I think my answer to the question is, from what I've read on the coasts, you know, New York, California, and the bigger companies, it does look like there's overall a lot in the diversity and inclusion world that's happening. I think with the George Floyd incidents and Black Lives Matter last year, I think a lot of attention was paid towards the African American community. And I think it's starting to get into that. It's starting to be more inclusive of the Asian American community as well. And I'm hopeful that that continues. Now I'm in Chicago in the Midwest, where it's less diverse. And I work also, my companies are all smaller companies, you know, more middle market. I'll say that it's going to be slower. You know, I'll just say this, and this is not an indictment, but there wasn't one Caucasian person that called me after Atlanta. You know, the only people that called me to check in on me were minorities. And so I think that's a product of being in the Midwest. I have a lot of Caucasian friends. Sorry, that sounds so bad. And, you know, I think that it's just going to take longer in the Midwest and with smaller companies. And so like my parting thought is, like, we need as a community to work from within the system, within big companies, and also externally, and put pressure. We need to speak up, right? Like, we can't let subtle racism kind of just go anymore. And I think it's going to be up to all of us to really continue and hopefully turn this moment into a movement for real change. It's kind of how I would leave it at.
Thank you. So I actually would love to, we did get some questions, and I'd love to, you know, take the time. And so to the audience, if you have any questions at all, feel free to drop them in the chat. But I did want to turn our focus to, you know, advice. A lot of the folks that we have dialed in are either in roles of marketing, communications, leadership within the financial services community. And even personally, I've gotten a lot of outreach about what can we do? What can we do to support our, you know, Asian American employees, you know, our clients? You know, should we be saying anything? Does it feel inauthentic if we do? So I would be curious, especially, I think, Sam, I'm going to kick off with you, is do you have any advice for financial services brands as to how they can demonstrate their support for their AAPI stakeholders?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are very practical kind of ways to go about this. I mean, one Gordon just kind of alluded to, I think there's, like, even from a kind of a corporate perspective, and I can only kind of base this on experience that we're having at MSCI right now, but we have tangibly tried to, you know, really focus on diverse slates for our recruiting and hiring efforts in real ways. And this has both kind of been impacted by Black Lives Matter, as well as the more kind of current Asian situation that we're all speaking about. So, it's a precarious time, obviously, in this country and in our industry. And I kind of feel generally that there's a bit of a inflection point, or kind of we're at the cusp of kind of seeing like, where's this going to go? And I think my advice is own that, whatever level you are at. If you're managing director level, if you're an associate level, just kind of own it and play your role. And that can mean many different things to many different people. But I think in my case, because I'm in the more senior ranks of the organization, yeah, I mean, this kind of gets back to some of the things we were talking about earlier. It may be a little bit uncomfortable for me even, but I feel like I've got to raise my voice at times. And I've been doing that a lot. So it's a little uncomfortable. And I would also say that even the diversity within the Asian community is profound, because I remember right after Atlanta, a good friend of mine who I work with, who's also a managing director, we called each other and we just said, okay, I think we need to do something here, but we're not really sure what we need to do. And we just decided on a whim, you know what, let's just host a call and anybody at the company can join. And that's how we positioned it. And I was flabbergasted that I think we had about 250 people join the call. Not all of them Asian either. It was pretty amazing. And because we're a global company, we had a lot of participation from people in EMEA. We had our Black Leadership Network that joined, so it just really kind of reminded me that these are really, and we're very focused on how we kind of advance our AAPI kind of specific agenda and career development, but this is actually bigger than us, and we're not in this alone, is what I learned during the 48 hours after that. Because like I said, I was really pleasantly surprised that many of my colleagues who I never would have thought would have joined calls like this. And then we actually started an Asian support network immediately after this. So, we're running it right now. We're owning it. We're having meetings on a regular basis. And I think good things are going to come out of this. But that's kind of my advice is, if you don't even know exactly what to do, just do something, jump in. And, as these things go, if you don't do anything, nothing's going to happen. But if you do something, something's going to happen.
I think that's great advice, Sam. Shani, I know you're probably also, I think your point of view from a content and communication standpoint, I'd be curious if you have any advice for marketers or, heads of content or internal communications folks in terms of their stuff that they could be saying even to support employees or otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's so interesting how when we are young, we are sort of pit against each other from our parents to be so competitive with other Asian kids. And also, I have so many similarities with you guys growing up, where in North Carolina, I was also one of the few Chinese kids in my high school. And so it's so interesting how at a young age, we're taught to be so competitive grades wise, but then when we grow up, it is this myth of this model minority where we're like afraid to speak out, or we have to keep our heads down. And it's a cultural thing, right? We don't want to make a fuss. We don't want to draw attention to ourselves. We just want to do the work and not ruffle any feathers. So from a marketing and branding standpoint, I think if you are in a position where you are a decision maker, definitely feature more Asians in your marketing and branding. Try to establish any apprenticeships or mentorships that you can, especially for any Asian employees that you might have who might be interested in like upward mobility in your company. So it's about all of that stuff, because we definitely have experienced, especially working in the South. I know exactly what Sam is talking about when he says, and Gordon are talking about when they're talking about that good old boy network. I experienced that, and you're not sure what that's all about when you've never experienced that before. But I think there are ways through apprenticeships, mentorships, just reaching out and supporting people who might be in positions below you, or if you are in that position where you can establish these kinds of programs and lend resources like that, then definitely do it.
Thank you, Shindy. Gordon, do you have any advice for financial services companies that might be looking for answers or ways in which they can support?
I think Shindy and Sam laid out a lot of pretty much what I would suggest as well. I mean, I think it's really, I just reiterate it, which is it's up to each of us individuals. Again, to Sam's point, it doesn't really matter what position you're in, but it's not a time to be quiet anymore. And you can find different ways to communicate. Like Shindy said, if she's introverted, there's different ways to communicate. And I would just say, make sure that you communicate, make sure you make your voice heard is probably the best thing I could say.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us on this panel. I mean, I feel like we could probably keep talking for the rest of the day, to be honest, because, there's so much wrapped in here about our professional experiences, our upbringing, and how that, shapes our identity and our careers. So I feel like we could probably do this in another 6 sessions, but I wanted to thank all of you for bringing all of your experiences to the table. And I know it's deeply personal, but also so deeply important to all of us that it was important and vital that we continue to share this with the world at large, and certainly all the folks on the phone. So thank you again for participating. We are so appreciative. And thank you to everybody who joined us for our discussion today. Hopefully this is just the first of many conversations that everyone can have with friends, families, colleagues, and others. So thank you again, everybody.